So at the start of the year, the vintage sportswear movement was at its peak. People like Natalia Sports and Isabella Vrana really helped to pioneer the trend when they went viral online for their really experimental, fashion-forward, vintage gym wear outfits. And it opened up a whole new reality for how people get dressed for the gym. And it also made women's sportswear more creative, fun, and also sustainable as well. What I find really cool is that this movement wasn't just another TikTok fashion micro trend. It truly changed and is still changing the way that people think about personal style in the gym. And it's also given rise to a whole new range of vintage sportswear businesses and also like a whole new category for how women's sportswear is designed as well. So now that the initial hype of the vintage sportswear movement has died down, I thought that it would be cool to do a check-in on where the movement lies 6 months later, and also look at the current landscape and use the current consumer behavior to kind of question if this movement was ever really about sustainability. But before we do that, if you're new to this channel, I'm Grace. I'm a fashion technology journalist based in London, and I use this channel to give my niche fashion tech takes along with the occasional trend, styling, or vlog fashion video as well. And like I said today, this week we're really going to be just doing a check-in on the vintage sportswear movement or the personal style in the gym movement and see how it is today. And then by looking how it is today, question if the sustainability benefit of this movement is even still present. So I think the best way to start this video is to do a recap of the trend. I am actually just going to use some points from this Dazed piece. This was from Natasha Cornelissen. I actually spoke to Natasha when she was writing this piece, so I was featured in this article, but she summarizes the trend really well, and I'm just going to take some points from there. Basically, as a recap of the trend, last year people started to grow tired of the modern, utilitarian athletic wear that had dominated women's sportswear for years. Alo Yoga is a great example here. It's clean, minimal, sculpted, and highly homogenized. Of course, there is still a big market for Alo Yoga, and there's still a lot of people that want to dress in their pieces, and it's a great brand. But to be fair, when you do look across the entire women's sportswear market, there is still surprisingly little variation, and most major brands still put out these mass manufactured, homogenized matching sets and nylon synthetic pieces. And basically, and put simply, the fashion girls were bored of this offering. As Natasha writes in this article, the fitness girls who love fashion were yearning for something more, and with more modern retailers sticking to the status quo, fashion girls hopped online to demonstrate a natural solution: vintage athletic wear. Obviously, from this point, the trend snowballed in a very similar way to how other TikTok micro trends snowball. It started as niche and then it became more mainstream and mass adopted. But now that we are 6 months on from the initial hype of this trend, now let's talk about where the vintage sportswear movement stands today. Unlike some micro trends that never reflected a genuine market need, vintage sportswear seems to have revealed an actual gap in the market. There was never maybe a meaningful demand for a style like tomato girl fashion, but there was clearly a demand for more expressive and characterful sportswear options for women. And now that the hype has subsided, we can really say that with confidence. I came across this reel from a creator called Tatum, I believe, and I think she's some kind of creative consultant in the sportswear industry. And she was basically saying that this whole trend has showcased that there is this demand for a certain type of sportswear, and that it isn't being fulfilled at scale yet. Therefore, this is exactly the white space that brand builders within this category should look to fulfill. She also had another really interesting observation that was something like trends often reveal unmet consumer demand. So even though some fashion trends may seem a bit shallow or superficial on the surface, they can often really reveal a true market gap in fashion. And with that in mind, it's now not surprising that over the past 6 months, we have seen a new kind of curated vintage store pop up, specifically vintage stores that focus on purely curated vintage sportswear. Some of my favorites include Give Me Those Numbers and also Rummage Stretch. And it's really cool because they've helped to really establish curated vintage sportswear within the curated vintage business market generally. Alongside this, we're also seeing a new kind of wave of creators creatives who are developing expertise in archival sportswear. One example who I'm really obsessed with her content is Emily Nabian, and she's really an expert in sportswear fabrications and materiality, and she also documents and heavily researches vintage athletic apparel as well, and it's so cool. I actually did interview Emily for What's Fashion Technology, so my Substack, and honestly her answers were so thoughtful and interesting, so I really recommend going and reading this if you are interested in this kind of expertise and content. But now I want to get into what I think is the most interesting evolution of this trend, specifically the emergence of brand new fashion products that aren't vintage sportswear but are inspired by the aesthetics of vintage sportswear. Alongside all the other ways that we've seen this trend evolve, one of the most notable developments, I think, is the fact that we're now seeing big brands and also small brands create new sportswear pieces that are inspired by the aesthetics of vintage sportswear. And I think this is where the conversation gets really interesting. A few months ago, for example, I noticed that the Spanish small brand Albus had released some product, or at least some brand imagery, that seemed to draw heavily from 1980s aerobic wear. Around the same time, I also noticed that Rummage Stretch had collaborated with Gummy, which is an LA small brand, and they'd created this series of technical tank tops, and you only have to look at these to see that they do also draw inspiration from vintage aesthetics, and I'm pretty sure that the brand also says this. I also know that there are a handful of examples from bigger sportswear brands as well. I can't remember them off the top of my head and I don't have all my notes, but I'm just going to put them here. But all of these brands have clearly taken inspiration from vintage pieces, but they're creating brand new collections with brand new materials. But perhaps the most literal example, and the one that we just have to use, is from Isabella Vrana. So at this point known to many as the original pioneer of this trend, and also the OG top Depop seller. She's basically just released a whole new collection of vintage inspired sportswear pieces, and I believe she took inspiration from some of her favourite vintage sportswear pieces that she's collected. And to me, this takes this movement into a whole new phase. Up until now, the trend has largely centred around sourcing, styling and recirculating existing garments. But when people begin designing and manufacturing entirely new products based on those aesthetics, the movement shifts from being just a vintage trend to becoming a design language in its own right. And that really cements it as this whole new category for women's sportswear. Now, there's honestly so many good things and bad things that we could say about the emergence of this new category. But the first thing that really came to my mind, and the thing that I think is really interesting to question, is that what happened to the sustainability narrative that originally surrounded the vintage sportswear movement in the first place. Before I do continue and say anything else, I do want to give the massive disclaimer that I'm not bashing on Isabella Vrana or any kind of small brand. I actually think that Isabella Vrana's new collection is so amazing and so cool. And like I said, she is really filling a gap for women within sportswear that hasn't existed at scale yet. And there is clearly a demand for this kind of product for women, so I do think it is really amazing. And I also think it's not fair to put any kind of sustainability claim or criticism on any kind of small brand, because the fact that they are a small brand is sustainable in itself. So it's really not about that, and I wanted to say that. What I'm really interested in is kind of thinking about the wider implications if big businesses or big brands do start creating mass-produced new products inspired by vintage sportswear. Obviously I have spoken about the good side of this and the good benefit of this becoming a new category within women's sportswear and what they're offered to by big brands. But surely it does still raise some important sustainability questions if big brands kind of jump on this as a trend and start mass producing new synthetic and harmful products. And the only reason why I'm saying this and why my mind kind of went to these thoughts when I was looking at how the vintage sportswear movement and trend is now is because when this trend first started gaining traction, Obviously, yes, it was about personal style, but there was also this parallel discourse around sustainability. Like, it was a fun trend, but it was also a sustainable trend. And a lot of different publications covered this. A lot of people were talking about the sustainability benefit of this trend as well. But now, surely, if this movement is leading to a whole load of new products being mass produced, surely we can question if this movement was ever truly about sustainability. Also, I'm assuming a lot of these new products will be made from synthetic materials like nylon and polyester, and surely that's not going to help all of the concerns that people have around synthetics and all of the harmful impacts of them as well. So in 2025, the New York Times reported increasing consumer concern around plastic exposure through workout clothes, particularly as discussions around microplastics have been more mainstream. The article noted that 72% of shoppers expressed a preference for plastic-free performance wear, and this really shows like a massive perception shift about how consumers think about sportswear and how they're made and what they're made from. Therefore, this has also birthed this whole new consumer demand for like new sportswear products, but sportswear products that are made from less harmful and more sustainable materials or more natural materials. And I honestly think this is just why the current state of the vintage sportswear movement is so interesting. Like, do consumers truly want non-synthetic sportswear options? And is it even right to create sportswear not with synthetic materials? And also, do people really care about the sustainability element of vintage sportswear in this trend? Or are they completely happy as long as the product fits into the aesthetics of this trend? I just want to say again that I'm really not talking about Isabella Vrana's collection here, or even some of the new, more emerging designers who are kind of blending sports and fashion, which I spoke about in my last video. So this is designers like Joanna Parv, Charlie Constantino. I think all of these kinds of new products are so cool and also so important to push fashion forward and to kind of blend like functionality with more fashion forward aesthetic. So it's really not about that. My concern really lies like elsewhere. What worries me is more the possibility that larger fast fashion brands begin replicating these aesthetics without the same level of intention. Like, if vintage inspired sportswear truly becomes another trend just to be mass produced at scale, then there's the risk that the movement loses many of the qualities that made it so compelling and so great in the first place. Like, instead of encouraging thoughtful consumption, we could simply end up with more synthetic products entering the market and another cycle of homogenized design in a way, like just dressed up as vintage inspired colors and silhouettes. But not to end on a totally negative point, we could also argue that this whole movement or like this whole consumer demand could also push brands in the opposite direction. Like, since consumers are genuinely seeking alternatives to conventional activewear, it may encourage brands to do like greater experimentation with sustainable materials and also circular production models and just generally new approaches to technical design. So overall, to conclude with my like final thoughts on this, I do think that like the good outweighs the bad within how the vintage sportswear movement is evolving. And I also don't think that creating new sportswear pieces inspired by vintage aesthetics is an inherently bad thing. And like I said, I do think it can open up some really cool possibilities for design, and brands can still do it in a really intentional and sustainable way if they want to. But really, we'll have to see how it all continues to evolve over the next 6 months. And that was everything that I wanted to talk about for this week's video. As always, I really hope you enjoyed this video. Leave your comments down below, like and subscribe if you want to. Remember to subscribe to my What's Fashion Technology Substack and also the Instagram for this as well. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you next time.